A very good evening. My name is Brainular. I am the co-founder of Pinakha Transformations and the creator of the Brainular Self, the framework which explains how brain creates mind. It explains how brain creates the framework of the self first, depending on the whole architecture of the self. The brain is able to create the mind, which clearly means that your mind, whatever you think, whatever you feel, whichever way you behave, whatever motivations you have, whatever are your purposes, whatever you feel as an ego, whatever thoughts come to you, whether you like them or not, are totally dependent on the framework of the self your brain has created. Your brain creates the framework of the self first, only then it is able to create mind. Your mind is totally dependent on what kind of the framework of the self you have. Now, in this following this principle, which I have just told you, the axiom, following this, you will now understand what I say next. Your whole life, the whole world you experience, is inside the three engines of this framework of self. Your whole life, your whole world is inside the framework of the self, the Brainular self. Okay. Now, what are those three engines? The first engine is your emotional engine. Now, don't get carried away. Don't assume anything. Emotional engine is not really only about emotions. Emotions are the outcome. Emotional engine is the engine which has all your selves. All your selves are created inside the emotional engine. Your emotional engine is interweaving and creating the stories of all your selves. That is where you are born. Emotional engine is where you are born, where your stories are created, where your emotional affiliations are born, where the emotional engine is where it is decided what emotions will you carry with yourself, what emotions you will use and use to deal with the external world. In other words, if you want to like something or if you are disliking something, is all because of the emotional engine. Your emotional engine creates multiple selves, and for those multiple selves, your emotional engine creates multiple stories. All those stories are coming from some sources which the emotional engine is using. So, if I have to take my own example of the emotional engine, in my emotional engine, what selves are there? Okay, I'm talking about Mrinal's there. What selves are there in Mrinal's emotional engine? So the first self will be cognitive neuroscientist, a cognitive neuro coach. That is my first self inside my emotional engine. Okay. The second self is I am a son to an aging mother. Okay, that is my second self. My third self will be I am an entrepreneur. Okay, I'm an entrepreneur. My fourth self will be I am a spiritualist who is a devotee of Bhagwan Ma Anandamai. Okay, now my emotional engine has created these four selves. Now that's not where the story ends. That's where the story begins. Now, in this emotional engine, for all these cells, my emotional engine is creating its stories, all the emotions related to these cells. For my self of a cognitive neuroscientist, it creates its emotional stories using the language of the brain. Using the language of the brain, it creates those stories which it takes in from the external environment. So, if you ask me, uh, Mrinal, uh, how are these stories creating an emotional engine? I would say for every story, there are within every self, okay? Within every self, there is a story running. And for every story, I am getting some positive emotion and I am not getting some positive emotion. That means for every story there is a source for a positive emotion, and there is absence of a source for a positive emotion. So what we do with you in our training programs is we go deep into your emotional engines. We deep dive into all the cells of your emotional engine. For each self, we find out what are the stories which are generating emotions, and then we find out what are the sources of the emotions you are able to receive, which are giving you growth and happiness, and what are the sources you are finding are absent, which are not giving you the impetus to grow emotionally as that self. So you see, unless your emotional engine is working properly and to its full potential, you can't have a self that will be able to emotionally respond to anything outside. Unless this emotional story of that self is completely fulfilling, it is growth oriented, yourself will not be able to positively, emotionally respond to anything outside. Therefore, you need to have an emotional story for every self. For every self, you need to have an emotional story. For every emotional story, you need to have the right sources to present you to give you the emotions which need to create that story. If some sources are absent, then you have to identify what sources are absent which are not giving you the emotion to grow as a self. So, as an emotional engine, your brain has created many cells. A cognitive neuroscientist, a son to a mother, uh, an entrepreneur, and a spiritualist. Now, for each of these cells, my emotional engine is creating its emotional stories, and it is drawing positive emotions from various sources to create a very positive emotional story for all these cells. Now, wherever the sources are absent, wherever you are not getting the positive emotions from, the sources are absent, your emotional engine shrinks. So you start feeling emotionally vulnerable, emotionally weak, emotionally inadequate, emotionally detached. You are not able to connect emotionally with things. You remain emotionally overwhelmed. All these are the signs that your emotional story is not functioning properly, is not being written properly by your brain. Now, the second thing which you have to understand is all these cells do not act independently. The emotional engine, inside the emotional engine, the brain interweaves these cells, which means the emotional story of each self overlaps the overlaps each other. So, emotional story of one self will overlap the emotional story of another self, will overlap the emotional story of the third self and fourth self. So that's an alchemy. That's like all the emotional stories are now creating a single emotional story of your single whole self in the emotional engine. So it's called neural binding in neuroscience. So it's a very complex phenomenon. And that's why it becomes very difficult to understand your own self emotionally, because all the cells and all their emotional stories, they overlap, they coalesce, they merge into each other to create one owner, to create one subjective experience, to create one experience, one subjective emotional experience of oneself. Okay, so multiple selves merge into one self to create the emotional engine of one owner. It becomes extremely complex and you feel overwhelmed, and there is a lot of complication. Now, how do I carry out an intervention with you in your emotional engine? I use the language of the brain. Now, language of the brain is not English, it's not French, it's not Bhojpuri, it's not Marathi, it's none of the native languages we speak. Language of the brain is the language in which the brain creates these selves and their emotional stories. Just like your uh, uh, programming language, when you create a program, when you create an app, you're using when you create a software, you're using codes, you're using the language of the program, you're using a different kind of language to create that software. That's not English. That's not Hindi. That's not in, any of the languages we speak. That's totally specific to that software. Similarly, the language of the brain is native to the brain. It is the language in which the brain thinks and creates your emotional engine. All right. So you need to have an intervention in that language to unravel the stories of all your selves, so that you know from which self which story is giving a very positive impetus to the whole engine, where in which self which story is getting negative impetus. Then also you also need to know what are the sources which are absent. That's the most important thing. That's where most coaching programs lack. They don't look at the sources absent. They are only looking at the sources which are giving you positive stories to the self, and which are the source for negative stories. They're not able to look at what is absent, which we call blind spot, emotional blind spots. That's Those blind spots come alive with the language of the brain. When I do an intervention with you in the language of the brain, that's where your emotional engine, that's where you start thinking in terms of all yourselves. You start thinking in terms of what are the stories going on. You're thinking in terms of what are the stories, what are the sources for all these stories, and what are the sources which you have not chosen yet. Extremely important. What are the sources which you have not chosen yet? Okay, so emotional engine. Now, if you think a little harder, emotional engine is the creator of your agency. Your agency is created inside the emotional engine. The owner of your life, the destiny maker of your life, the one who is deciding the fate and the actions and the behaviors, is created in the emotional engine. If the emotional engine is weak, your agency is going to be weak also. So, let me illustrate with an example. There is somebody called Mrinaldhar who says, "This is my body, this is my mind, this is my decision to go live on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube right now. This is my decision to think and speak about the brainular self." This owner, this owner who has visualized, felt, and decided the whole program right now, which is happening right now, is born in emotional engine. Now imagine if this owner, the one who says, "I am Ronaldo, I am conducting this live event, I am talking about the bigger self," if this owner, which we also call as agency or the agent, is not strong enough, is not powerful enough, if my emotional engine is weak, do you think this owner will be able to take strong decisions, will be able to think clearly and decide what to do and what not to do? Do you think that's going to happen? Yeah. No? Okay. So the emotional engine is where you are born. It's the womb. It's where everything. That's why when women are pregnant and they go to their doctors, they tell them you have to be very healthy. You have to eat very healthy. You have to eat very healthy so that the baby is born fully healthy. Am I correct? Your baby should be born fully healthy. You want to you want to give it the proper nutrition so that the development of tissues, the development of muscles, the development of bones takes place as best as is possible. Same is with the emotional engine. That's where you are born. That's where your agency is born. All right. So that's step one. Now, the step two is once your emotional engine is ready, once your agency is ready, that's when you are able to decide with what you will be emotionally attached. What will you be emotionally attached to? Will you be emotionally attached to some purpose? Will you be emotionally attached to find sources and resources? Will you be emotionally attached to identifying what are your goals and objectives? Will you be emotionally attached to go from one position to another position? These choices, emotional choices, are made by the owner, the agency. So, more powerful, more developed the agency, easier it becomes for it to make the choices and to choose. Okay. So, this process of choosing is your second engine. Your second engine is called the cognitive engine. It is in the cognitive engine that the emotional engine starts choosing. It is inside the cognitive engine, the emotional engine. Now, where the owner was born, where the agency was born, that owner, that agency now starts making choices. So, in emotional engine, the agency is born. In the cognitive engine, your intelligence your cognitive agility is born. So your emotional engine decides whether you will choose intelligence or not. Your emotional engine decides whether you will choose cognitive agility or not. If the agency that is created in the emotional engine is weak and you are not working on it, you will try your best to operate in the cognitive engine, but you won't be able to make the right choices. You will try to choose intelligence, but you won't have the agency, the capacity, the emotional capacity to choose it. You will try your best emotionally, you know, to choose cognitive agility. You will try your best to choose from what position you want to go to the other position, but you will be emotionally, you will feel emotionally inadequate, emotionally exhausted to do that, which means your agency will be weak. So in cognitive engine, we have all the choices. And to what things we will attach emotionally to, that power comes from the emotional engine. So the first part of this Brainular self framework is emotional engine. Once the agency is born in the emotional engine, we go to the next one, which is the cognitive engine, where once your agency is ready, you start making choices. You start deciding how you will deal with the external environment. What purposes will you choose and why? So if your emotional engine has created a powerful agency, you are able to choose the purposes which require intelligence and cognitive agility, because you have the emotional wealth to spend on that. You have the emotional wealth to attach yourself to that kind of purpose and to that kind of cognitive agility. Your thinking becomes very easy because it is backed by emotional wealth. So in cognitive engine, life becomes three-dimensional. In emotional engine, the life is two-dimensional. In cognitive engine, the life is three-dimensional. When I say in cognitive engine, the life is three-dimensional, what I mean to say is in cognitive engine, you go from a helpless infant to somebody standing on its own feet. So that journey of moving from point A to point B, utilizing all the resources, working on your purpose, deciding your progress, that intelligence and cognitive agility is the cognitive engine. The journey really starts in cognitive engine. The language of the brain in cognitive engine is totally different from the language of the brain in the emotional engine. They have nothing in common. They are totally different languages. In cognitive engine, you have to work with the person with respect to intelligence and cognitive agility using the language of the brain and all the aspects of the external environment. the whole process of decision making is carried out by cognitive engine. In cognitive engine, what I do is see what is your position. It is called meaning activation body schema. Okay, that's the language of the brain. So I take you through the meaning activation body schema to see what is your current position with respect to everything: intelligence, cognitive agility, with respect to your choices, with respect to the sources in the external environment. And I check whether your agency is working to its full capacity to make those choices. And that's where we find out what is lacking. That's when we find out why progress is not happening. What's lacking? In cognitive engine, if I have to talk technically, verticality schema gets added. So from in emotional engine, it's length and breadth. In cognitive engine, it is length, breadth, and height. You, your world becomes 3D. And that's where subjective experience becomes extremely powerful. You experience everything subjectively. Meaning making happens. You apply intelligence to find meaning in things. You apply philosophy. You apply your practical values and beliefs. And that's where we have to work on your intelligence and cognitive agility. So that's a cognitive intervention. Once your brain has taken you from emotional engine to your cognitive engine, your life becomes very complex. Your, your world inside your head becomes very complex. You are not able to find out what is working and what is not working. Because emotional engine is so complex. You don't know which self is working, where the emotional story is stuck. In cognitive engine, you don't know what is your current meaning activation body schema. Now the problem is for each self in the emotional engine, for each self inside the emotional engine, there is a corresponding cognitive engine. That means if inside your emotional engine there are 5 selves, then for each self you have a separate cognitive engine. For each self you have 5 separate cognitive engines. You experience life as one, unitary, one. You experience your agency as one. But that's not how brain works. Your brain has created 5 agencies for 5 separate selves, and it is employing those agencies on 5 different cognitive engines. Do you even realize that? No. You experience it as one. One emotional story, one cognitive story, one agency. That's called neural binding. Neural binding is where the sum of parts becomes one whole experience, and one whole experience looks much bigger than the sum of parts. In our training program, we go to the next most important engine, because that is where you experience for the first time free will. Free will. And that engine is perception engine. Perception engine is where we go into your brain, into your mind, where we use the language of the brain and open up the topographical map of the world inside you. Topographical map, which means, in simple words, I go into your mind, I use the language of the brain, and I find out your life currently is an Amazon jungle. I go to another person called Shruti. I use the language of the brain and I find out what is the topographical map of her life, and it turns out to be a cosmopolitan city with a lot of traffic jams and with a lot of concrete buildings and no greenery. I go to the third person called Rohit, and I apply the language of the brain, and I open the topographical map of the world he is experiencing because of the two engines, the emotional engine and the cognitive engine, and turns out his life is the Battle of Troy. His life is nothing but two armies fighting it out every day. Every conversation he has, every idea he has, every project he has, every purpose he has, every goal and objective he has is nothing but a war between two armies. Three people, three different topographical maps. Now, based on your topographical map, using the language of the brain, we are able to experience free will to decide what kind of topographical map I want, number one. If I want the same topographical map, what changes I want to make. Because the brain is freed now. The brain is freed now. It is freed. Once the brain is freed because we are using the language of the brain, immediately, it is able to decide what changes it wants to make. So, if you are leading a team, if you as a leader, as a manager, are leading a team, or if you are leading a team during a challenging scenario, or you don't want uncertainty while leading a team, you don't want you want to predict behavior. You want to know how this person is going to behave in the next 6 months. What is going to be the learning curve, and what is going to be the behavioral curve and the emotional curve and the cognitive curve, and you want to have a certainty. You want to predict it correctly. You want to have a control, a positive control that will enable collaboration, that will enable a sort of learning and a sort of a connect, a rapport, okay, where two people are working together. If you want that, this is the training program for you, which we are going to roll out very soon. If, as a coach, you have come across difficult clients, you know, difficult scenarios. The client is not opening up. I can bet you, I can assure you, because you didn't know this framework, the emotional engine, the cognitive engine, and the perception engine, you've been trying to use a framework without going through the emotional engine of that person. Now, this is where this framework becomes important. Even the person who is most inhibited, or who's a little egoistic and stubborn, or who's not very open and communicative, Everybody opens up in the emotional engine because we are talking about their multiple selves using the language of the brain. What is the purpose of the language of the brain? It frees you. It takes away all the inhibition. It takes away all the guilt. It frees the mind and gives it complete freedom to allow itself to speak for itself. That's the power of the language of the brain. So, once again, my name is Brinaudhar. I'm the co founder of the Pinakha Transformations, and you will hear from us again and again. Our training programs are for coaches, our training programs are for managers and leaders leading teams, our training programs are for storytellers who want to create stories, right? uh, publish books, or they're from advertising and marketing and want to know more about how to get into the mind of the customers and clients, about people who want to build rapport with their stakeholders, you can get in touch with us. Programs are going to be rolled out in another week or 10 days, and we conduct a lot of webinars also. We are coming up with our next podcast. Our next podcast is going to be with the world's most favorite storyteller. She's the world's number one storyteller. Okay. Yes, the world's most favorite storyteller. Her book is a worldwide blockbuster. So I'm going to keep it as a surprise. You will hear it from tomorrow in another video, and would love to hear from you. You have any questions? Get in touch with me. Uh, all my details are there on the Pinakha website, www.pinakha.com. All right. So thank you very much, and you have a good evening.